Hi, are you a survivor of narcissistic abuse, domestic violence? I am too. And if you're not, thanks for joining me because I'm going to be talking about some very common reasons why a victim stays in an abusive dynamic. I know it's hard from an outsider's perspective looking in, who's wondering if you can see abuse and you know that this person's unhappy, why are they staying? Especially if they can physically get up and leave, what is preventing them from walking out that door? Or perhaps you have known a friend or a loved one that is in an abusive dynamic and they've left, but you see them going right back. They complain, you've seen them physically come undone, they're not happy, but yet they don't seem to break away. You know, the truth is, it's not a very clear answer. There's lots of complexities that come into these abusive dynamics that will contribute to keeping a victim in their circumstances. You know, there's elements of emotional, physical, psychological, and even sexual abuse in narcissistic abuse relationships and or domestic violence cases. And typically there's a co-occurrence between one or all of these elements. But also, you know, what contributes is cultural conditioning, how a person is raised, or some societal norms. All of these things factor into keeping a victim in their abusive environment. So, for example, when we think of fear of consequence is very real, especially when there's a threat of violence to bodily harm or physical, sexual violence in some fashion. That will prevent anybody from moving forward with anything. You don't necessarily have to be in an abusive dynamic, but when there are all of these different elements of abuse that come into play in a toxic environment, the threat of a real consequence of perhaps losing your life or being detached from your children, losing your home or belongings, or something happening in a smear campaign that could ruin your reputation and harm you in some way. All of these are real threats to a person, and that fear of consequence will keep them in a state of analysis paralysis, overthinking a lot of what could happen and preventing them from moving forward, even if the outcome is potentially happy, peace, love. It will prevent a person from moving forward if there's a real threat to their person, to their self and their loved ones. Additionally, as you grow up, if there is an element of abuse in some way that's been invalidated or dismissed, and you know, as a child, you do know right from wrong, but you're subjected to what you are without really being able to do anything about that. So eventually you become conditioned to accept it, and it seems normal. As you grow older and you partner with somebody, we typically gravitate towards people that have a sense of familiarity to us. And if there is an element of abuse introduced, it's not going to seem abnormal. It's not going to seem out of sorts in some way, even though you don't like it and you don't want to deal with it, but you do because that's what you were having to do when you were a child and you grew up that way. So it's difficult for somebody to fix what they can't see is broken. And how do you do that if you can't identify that you've even become a victim in some way? Okay. So additionally, shame and embarrassment will prevent anybody from speaking up about lots of things. We often care way too much about what other people think, and that will create this sense of fear from speaking up about injustices in our life. We don't like people to know that we're not perfect, right? We all have this idea in mind that we need to be as perfect as possible and live perfect little lives, and that's absurd because nobody is perfect. But nonetheless, it will prevent a victim from rising up and using their voice to speak up. Additionally, if they were not taught to stand strong, if they were not taught to have confidences, it makes it even harder to speak up and to leave these dynamics. But oftentimes, a lot of shame and embarrassment surrounding whether or not a person is believed, or perhaps they are more strong-willed, they don't want to be perceived as weak. So there's lots of elements that come into play, but shame and embarrassment will also keep a victim in their toxic environment. And additionally, intimidation, as I've mentioned, with fear of consequence. You know, if you're being threatened in some kind of way, and there's just real fear factor with intimidation tactics. So it prevents a person from moving forward to safety. And sometimes, unfortunately, when a victim is trying to weigh the consequences of the pros and cons of leaving, it makes it hard because there are all of these elements that are playing into cognitive decline and just a lot of fear and maybe mental and health distress. So it's not like you can sit back and just have a rational thought process. Like somebody who's not being subjected to abuse can, it's not really the same thing. So there's lots of intimidation happening. Even just use of words can prevent somebody from moving forward if they're already gripped in the throes of being a victim of violence or abuse in some way. And additionally, lack of resources. If you don't have financial independence, if you're relying on your abuser for financial provisions, or perhaps culturally speaking, you grew up in a situation where you reared the home and raised the kids while your partner went and made the money. It's hard when you don't have job skills. If you leave the house and you look for jobs that pay you now to do the things that you're doing at home, those are very low paying jobs that are not going to sustain you because they're not providing a living wage. So it makes it hard for a person to leave that dynamic when they can't support themselves. When you consider that some victims have children, now they're not worried about just themselves. How are they going to put a roof over their head and food in their stomachs for everybody? Oftentimes survivors are looking for help outside of the home, but not everybody has additional help. When you have to really come down to deciding if you can afford to eat or you can afford to put the roof over your head, how do you make a decision between those two when they're the basics of life? And you can't make that choice. So unfortunately, oftentimes people recognize that even if they are working, they can't thrive by themselves. So they thrive better together financially even in an ugly, toxic environment. So people will stay and they'll just stay in this comfort of discomfort and toxicity because it just makes financial sense. But those are a lot of reasons why a person will stay in an abusive dynamic, including love. You can really love your partner and still hate them. They're mutually exclusive of the other, but those convoluted dynamics can prevent somebody from moving forward to safety. When you go through a healing process, you do recognize that what you have been contributing all along is not genuine, authentic love. It's not like it's not coming from a place of sincerity. It's just if you can't love yourself and you don't have the skills that of strength and boundaries and feelings of empowerment, confidence, self-worth, you will allow these abusive dynamics into your life or even in some fashion contribute to them, right? But it's hard for somebody to see what is wrong or imbalanced if perhaps culturally they grew up around these dynamics and nobody else is speaking up about that or against it. It makes it hard if everybody's looking at you like you're the black sheep and you're creating waves or problems in a situation that everybody has accepted as normal in their life. So it's hard, but when you are finding authentic and genuine love in self, you do recognize in hindsight that what you had contributed to these abusive dynamics or had allowed in your life, that wasn't actually real love. So, but nonetheless, love can keep you in a situation through a real deep emotional connection to your abuser. So that's where you form a trauma bond, and that codependency, circular relationship style, no matter if it's abusive, will take root and it will make it very, very difficult for a victim to leave that dynamic. So I hope that I've been able to enlighten you. These are some very common reasons why a victim stays in these circumstances. But if you are currently in a domestic violence situation or you have left and you're struggling with how to heal, I'm going to put links to give you resources right here at the bottom here. But I want to say thank you for your time, and please do not forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.